Okay, now we're going to talk about one of the most ignored subjects in all of freeze drying, vlogging, and videos, YouTube, whatever, and that is dairy, specifically cheese. Now, I spent the better part of about 2.5 months doing nothing but cheese, experimenting with it, learning how to prepare it to freeze dry. Freeze drying is easy, everybody knows how to freeze dry. How to package it for long-term storage, and more specifically, how to rehydrate it so that it is close, if not exactly like it was before you freeze dried it. I'm Evan Rowell, and this is Critical Thinking. All right. About 2 months ago, 2 months, maybe a little bit more, 2.5 months ago, I embarked on a project where I wanted to learn about cheese because there was so little information out there. For most people, it's very difficult to reconstitute cheese, and I have discovered that's because most people reconstitute freeze-dried food, or dehydrated food for that matter, wrong. Okay? Right now, the attitude for most people, or at least not the attitude, but the preconceived idea with freeze drying is that you just take food, you throw it on a tray, you put it in the freeze dryer, you freeze dry it, you pull it out, you put it in a bag, you seal it up, and throw it on a shelf with an oxygen absorber in it. And then when it comes time to reconstitute it, or they want to eat it or something, you open up the bag, you dump the contents into a bowl of water, and you wait until it's rehydrated, dump off the excess water, and voila, you got your food back. Not true, okay? There's a lot more involved. There's a lot more that you can learn about freeze drying, and that is exactly what I am attempting to do here, is to teach people about cheese. Now, what you see in front of you here is about almost 40 pounds of cheese. Every one of these jars is a different kind of cheese or dairy product. And then I have pre-measured quantities of several of them that I'm going to rehydrate. I'm going to show you how well it rehydrates, and I'm going to give you some tips and tricks about the rehydration process. So the first thing I want to do is I want to start out with the day one when I was doing this project. On day one, I decided that I was going to do several different types of cheese. I wanted to do a hard cheese, I wanted to do a semi-soft, I wanted to do a soft cheese, and I wanted to do a liquid. So that's what I did on the 4 trays. On the liquid tray, of course, I put whole milk, which is in this bottle right here. On this second tray, I tried to do some brie, which is a soft cheese. And this is what turned out here. And I got quite a bit to say about soft cheese. On the third tray, I did... this is cheddar cheese right here. You can see it was about 1/2 inch, maybe 3/8 inch thicknesses that I cut it into. It came out, it was very hard. On the fourth tray, I did Velveeta cheese. I kind of went wild with it. I took the whole 2-pound block and I cut it up into 1/2 inch sections and laid it out on the tray. And you know, all of this freeze dried very, very well, but listen to that. Oh, and another thing, I did do some queso in solid block. I cut the round cheese block into wedges, and I freeze dried those, and they, like the Velveeta cheese, came out very, very hard. Okay, I even did some string cheese. I don't know how well that's going to work, but anyhow, I want to start by telling you what I did with this Velveeta. It's actually kind of funny. If you see this block right here, that is a very hard block. And what I did to try to rehydrate it was I just dumped it in a bowl of water. And you know something? After 4 days, it absolutely destroyed what I had in there, the block of cheese that I had in there. Because what it did was it turned the outside into this mushy, slimy, white, whatever you want to call it there. And then below that, there was a thin layer of what looked like it could have been Velveeta cheese if I wanted to scrape off that slime. And then in the middle of it, it was still rock hard. I was so disappointed because I thought, well, you can't do Velveeta cheese. Well, that's not true. You can, and I'll show you how. All right. The cheddar cheese, this was sharp cheddar cheese, It came out the same way. It was really hard. As a matter of fact, I was showing this Velveeta cheese to a friend of mine, and he looks at it and he says, you know, if you put that with a little sand and mortar, you can probably use it to repair your brick wall. And he's absolutely right. This block and this one here are extremely hard. They almost feel like plastic. And this, like the Velveeta, would not rehydrate. I put it in water, I left it out room temperature, I put some in water in the refrigerator, and it was absolutely terrible the way it turned out. Okay, however, on the next batch, I took a 2-pound bag, as a matter of fact, I have it right here, of shredded cheese, and I dumped it, the whole bag, into this tray. Now, most people, when they look at that tray, they're told, don't fill the tray just barely above the depth of the tray. But when you dump a 2-pound bag of cheese into there, and I'm going to show you right now what it looks like when you dump all that much cheese into one of these freeze dryer trays. Oh, brother, I'm making a mess here. Okay? What you see here is cheese that literally fills that tray up to overflowing, to mounding. It looks like you probably got too much cheese in there. Well, the fact is, you don't. If you spread this out and you pack it down a little bit, not too much, that will dehydrate just fine. Okay, and the reason being is that, number one, you've only got 2 pounds in there, which is 2.5 to 3 pounds is the recommended amount of food that you want to put in one of these trays. And also, because it's shredded, there are lots of air pockets. Air can permeate this cheese and get all around it and everything. So you can put 2 pounds of cheese in there. And so that second batch, I had a 2-pound bag of sharp cheddar, and I had a 2-pound bag of Colby Jack. All right, and when they came out, they were fine. They were great. They were completely dry. I could pick them up in my fingers and I could crumble them a little bit. You can see it right here, what you got. And it was wonderful, but I still didn't know if it would reconstitute properly. So one of the first things I learned, and I'm going to set this aside here. One of the first things I learned about freeze drying cheese is I noticed that the cheese that was shredded would reconstitute. I took some of that cheese and I put it in some water and I let it sit. I let it sit for about 12 hours, and that's one of the first things you're going to learn about reconstituting cheese or rehydrating it, is it can take about half as long to 2/3 as long to reconstitute it properly as it did to freeze dry it. So if you take your cheese and you just mix it with a little bit of water and you come back an hour later and it's not where you want it to be, don't think that you've destroyed it, unless of course you put it in too much water, which is something I'll talk about in a minute. Let it sit a little bit longer, and if it's got the right amount of moisture in it, it will reconstitute very, very well. So what I did was I started with hard cheeses, and it dawned on me that some cheeses you're not going to want to reconstitute, and Parmesan is one of those. I dehydrated this Parmesan cheese, and yes, Parmesan cheese does have a moisture content in it, and it will lose some weight. But it's a cheese that you're not going to want to reconstitute. Okay. The next cheese up the line was my Quesos, or Mexican melting cheese. It's a drier cheese, but yeah, you do want to reconstitute it. And if you remember, when I freeze dried it in a block, in pieces, it was hard. It would not reconstitute. But what I did was I took it in my KitchenAid there, and I got a shredding attachment, and I shredded the queso cheese before I freeze dried it, and it made a world of difference in its rehydration abilities. So anyhow, as I was experimenting along, I quickly discovered after the third batch that it's important to know how much water came out of the cheese so that you don't try to put that much more water back into it. Okay, I mean more than that back into it. You have to strike that balance. So what I do is I take a kitchen scale, and when I just bought this one at Walmart, and I will weigh that whole tray before I freeze it, before I put it into the freeze dryer. And I will take note of that, because what happens is that when it comes out of the freeze dryer, it's completely dry. I'll weigh it again, and that way I'll know how much moisture came out of that. Now I know that 2 pounds is 8 cups, so I divided the amount of water that came out of it by the 8 cups, and so I know exactly how much water needs to go back in to 1 cup of freeze-dried cheese. As a matter of fact, for this sharp cheddar, it requires 5 tablespoons per cup of freeze-dried cheese. Now each one of these, and they're all pretty close. But let's go through them here. Parmesan, I don't bother to do. The Queso cheese is 5 tablespoons per cup of freeze-dried cheese. The feta is also 5. The sharp cheddar cheese is 5, and that includes all the rest of them. I have provolone, I have Monterey Jack, I have Colby Jack, and I have all the Jack cheeses in here. The American cheese, however, is a little bit drier at 4.5 tablespoons per cup. The Munster, again, is 4.5. And the Swiss, oddly enough, is between 2 and 3 tablespoons per cup of freeze-dried cheese. And then you come around here, just for the fun of it, I did some pub cheese, and I haven't rehydrated any of that. Well, I'm going to, so I don't know exactly how much it is. But here I have some sour cream, and this takes 3/4 of cups of water to 1 cup of sour cream. And here we got cheddar cheese. It's a 1/2 cup to 1 cup of cream cheese. Cottage cheese was an interesting one. It came out looking like, I'm not sure what you'd call that. It was a real coarse, grainy material. You could see the curds in it. But it takes 10 tablespoons of water. In other words, it takes a full 5 ounces, or I think that's a little over 3/4 of a cup of water per 1 cup of cottage cheese. Then Velveeta, the one that I had so many problems with. It does reconstitute wonderfully if it's shredded first. And it takes 6 tablespoons of water to 1 level cup of freeze-dried cheese. Now, here was kind of a weird one. This is goat cheese. I decided to go ahead and do goat cheese, and it takes 10 tablespoons or 5 ounces of water for every cup of goat cheese that you use. But the funny thing about goat cheese is you can put it in a solid block. I discovered that once this one was freeze-dried, and when it would come out, it would just crumble in your hands. Unlike this stuff here, like I say, you could repair a brick wall with it. Okay, then I even went so far as I do yogurt. It takes 8 tablespoons of water per cup. Then there was the half and half. It takes 14 tablespoons per cup. In other words, it takes a cup and a half of water for every cup of dried half and half. Here's whole milk. Whole milk is about 1 to 1. Okay, 1 cup of whole milk with 1 cup of solids, and you'll have whole milk. And then here's one that I don't freeze dry. This is butter. Okay, butter, you can freeze dry it, but you have to separate out the fats and the oils, and that's just too difficult to do. So I buy it canned. Now, if you'll notice, when I first opened the can up, the number 10 can, this was full. But in my freeze drying processes, I will often use the butter in with the packages so that I have, if the recipe calls for butter, and I'll put butter in there, and I use a lot of it, and it's really convenient, but it's a lot more cost effective than if I should try to do it myself. Okay, it's just cheaper. And then, last but not least, there is ice cream, and this is ice cream sandwiches. Okay, ice cream dehydrates really well, but this is one of those things that you don't want to rehydrate, is ice cream, because it'll just turn to mush. As soon as it gets wet, it'll melt, and you can't rehydrate it in the freezer. So anyhow, I have all of these cheeses here, and the first rule of freeze drying and consuming cheese after it's freeze dried is do not rehydrate it unless you have to. Okay, unless you need to melt it for something, don't try to rehydrate it. You can always put it in your recipes dry, and the moisture in your recipe will rehydrate the cheese. Or if you need to have solid cheese for, a hamburger or something, generally I will mix the cheese in with the burger itself, and I'll mix it in dry. I might put in a tablespoonful of water to make up for the fact that the cheese is going to draw some of the water out of the hamburger, which sometimes that's what you want it to do. Sometimes that's going to make for a better burger. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to reiterate the three things that you need to know about cheese. And that is, number one, don't try to freeze dry cheese that is solid. You always want to shred it so that you've got small pieces. And the reason that seems to work is the surface area of the cheese in relation to its cross section has quite a bit to do with how well it rehydrates. The surface area of a piece of this Velveeta cheese is relatively small when it comes to the cross section if I was to cut one of those blocks in half. The surface area of this shard of cheese right here is very large considering the cross section or the inside of that shard. So it's important. So number one is don't try to freeze dry cheese unless you shred it. And there is a way to shred soft cheese. I'll get to that in section 2, how it is that you can effectively shred soft cheese. Because if you try to shred Velveeta, all you're going to do is you're going to take your shredder and you're going to turn it into a gummed up ball. And you're going to be very unsuccessful unless you do something first. Okay, number 2 is make sure you know how much moisture your cheese loses in the freeze drying process. Okay, that means weighing the cheese before you put it in, and then weighing it after you take it out. Now I take my kitchen scale here, and I'll weigh the whole tray, because it doesn't matter. As long as you weigh the whole tray when it comes back out, the difference in the weight is going to tell you how much moisture whatever was in that tray lost. And that's very important when it comes to rehydrating cheese. And number 3, don't be impatient. It takes a long time for cheese to balance itself out with the moisture. Make sure that you don't put your cheese in more water than it's lost. Okay, so those are the 3 tips and tricks that I'm telling you in this video. In part 2, you'll see what I do with soft cheeses, with ice creams, with half and halves, with brie, and other cheeses that you might or might not have to shred. Because, like I said before, goat's milk, you don't have to shred it. Cottage cheese, of course, you don't have to shred it. Sour cream, you don't have to shred. Okay, so, and there are some that you do still have to shred in order to make it freeze dry properly. So with that, I'd appreciate it very much if you would hit the subscribe bell so that you'll know when the next section comes out, and you'll be able to continue to take this journey with me if you're a freeze dryer. I go in depth into freeze drying, especially with different foods. I don't just take something and go, oh, here's something, let's freeze dry it, let's dunk it in water and see if we can rehydrate it and then eat it. There's more to it than that, because we're going to go into, I'll have videos that talk about how to repackage things or package things for the long term, for efficiency, so that you can take up as little space as you can. I'll talk about things that really shouldn't be freeze-dried, but you can still package for long term, how to combine things. I've got a lot of information. So hit that notification bell, become a subscriber, tell your friends, hit the share, do whatever it is you really want to do. But if nothing else, as you've heard before, if you've been following me, I'm a professional photographer. And I have a gallery that I'd like you to visit. And I'm not big on selling things, but, you know, I am big on hearing people's opinions about my work. Okay, what they like, what they don't like, what they think I should do more of. It's Evan Ralph Photography. there's the address right there, and I'll have a link here down below. If you have a mind to, I'd appreciate it if you take a look and tell me what you think. So with that, I'm Evan Rowell, and this is Critical Thinking.